Good evening, everyone. My name is Claiborne Benson, here, Executive Director of Wisconsin Black Historical Society, and we have a fantastic evening for those of you who are members, those of you that want to be members, and those of you who are just friends. We're in store for a real treat this evening. Uh, and we're going to talk about the Civil War. We're going to talk about the Civil War members and units, and we're excited about it. So, Jeff, Jeff Cannon is here to share his thoughts with us. He has a new book out, "Make Make Way for Liberty: African Americans in the Civil War, or Wisconsin's African Americans in the Civil War." Very, very interesting subject. Most folks think we just got here in the 1950s, and yet we've been here since this was merely a beginning of a state in many forms: free people and trampers and guides and frontiersmen, and yes, enslaved people. And so it's an opportunity to talk about our contributions to this nation via the Civil War and World War One and two. So here we are. So thank you, Jeff, for coming. And you have some opening comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. The book came out about a year ago in the middle of the pandemic, so I wasn't really able to do much promotion of the book or speaking about it, and just started up doing some events this fall. A lot of them like this being virtual events, but I hope to keep doing it, doing some more in the spring when we can
Sure.
do things live.
We'd like to have you back as well too, because
I'd be glad to come back.
you're not going to the general public is not going to learn all of this in one setting. It takes time.
No, it's very hard to pick and choose what I put into these, because there's so many stories behind this, and there's so many things that couldn't go into the book either, just for space reasons. So I'll pull some of the big ones out of the book and some that aren't in the book for you tonight. So,
and I'll ask some questions, and we're going to have a good time. So,
okay.
Why don't you go ahead and start at your leisure?
Okay. All right. I want to put up these two quotes at the beginning just because I think they're very relevant for what we're doing. One is a little quote that's used by a lot of veteran support groups, and it certainly applies to African American veterans from the Civil War. Dying for freedom is not the worst thing that could happen. Being forgotten is. They were definitely forgotten, written out of history, and I'm glad to be part of the effort of many people to bring that history back to light again. The other one I just heard recently from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, attributed to Doc Rivers, two Wisconsin icons. We continually try to show our love for this country, and the country continues to try to show that it doesn't love us. And that's very much a part of the story of the Wisconsin veterans too. As I'm going through this tonight, I'm going to name many of these soldiers. There's no test. I don't expect you to remember any of them, but they had names, they had lives before the war, after the war, and some of them gave their lives up during the war. So Shadrach Valentine's the first one I'll mention here, lived in Dane, Adams, and Pierce counties, all in Wisconsin, served in the 102nd U.S. Colored Infantry, and died in service in November 1864. On the slides that come after this, anytime a name shows up in red, it's the name of a soldier. I want to credit the people who got me started in this about 10 or 11 years ago. They're the reenactors for Company F, 29th U.S. Colored Infantry, a group of reenactors, African-American reenactors from Milwaukee. In doing the research on these soldiers, I ran into the reverse problem from a lot of genealogists who, working from the present back toward the Civil War, have trouble getting back to it. My problem was starting from the Civil War and coming up to the present and finding any descendants. The records of the U.S. colored troops are incredibly detailed and rich, and they're all in one place, the National Archives, and in some online services too. Very complete, much better than for soldiers who served in Wisconsin regiments. So, and in a few interesting cases, me working from the Civil War and people in the present working back toward the Civil War, we met in the middle and helped each other out. So I'll talk about one of those at the end. I want to mention Edward Hunter as an example of the difficulties that the African American settlers, pioneers had in Wisconsin and the hostility that they sometimes encountered. He was a barber in Fond du Lac, Waupaca, and Markesan, married a native Stockbridge woman in 1854, so he was here a long time. In 1860, he shows up in the census in Fond du Lac, and the household right above him was John Riley, who also served in the Civil War, not as a soldier, but as a barber in the Iron Brigade. Edward Hunter tried to make a speech on Independence Day, 1858, while he was living in Waupaca, and he was harassed, hounded, driven off the stage by a group in the crowd who threw things at him, called him names, and harassed him all the way home. There were some people in Waupaca who were mad about that and scheduled him to appear 2 nights later to make the speech that he wanted to deliver for Independence Day. He did the speech, but walking home after dark, he was attacked by the same group of people with rocks, eggs, etc. His house was vandalized, and so on. The people who were accused of it were taken to court, fined, and one of them was a school teacher of all things and lost his job. So there was a punishment for this, but obviously he had taken a risk to speak out, even on the occasion of Independence Day. He didn't stay in Markesan, which is why you find him in 1860 here in Fond du Lac. Now, early in the war, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, you had people like Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany who were pushing Lincoln to open the army to black men who were eager to serve. In the case of Delany, he himself served. In the case of Douglass, his 2 sons served. But they were barred from state militias and from the federal army. And it stayed that way for the first year and a half, almost 2 years of the war. There was also pressure on the governor of Wisconsin to open the ranks. The men who are named here were all African-American men in Wisconsin who wrote to the governor or went to visit him in person to ask him to open the Wisconsin militia, the Wisconsin regiments in infantry, cavalry, etc., to black men. The governor's answer in those first 2 years of the war, and actually the first almost 3 years of the war, was no.
I think we lost him. You have to talk. We lost him.
Okay, so he's going to rejoin us in a minute or two. We just had a technical difficulty here, but he'll rejoin us and share his thoughts with us. And so um, I found his book to be quite interesting. I'm going to hold it up for you to take a look at it, and it is quite interesting. Uh, Although he started talking about a few stories, but there's some interesting things that I want to share with you that I thought was very interesting. He does such an individual look at, you can see that, of each individual soldier that goes and serves in the Civil War. And he lists them by name, where they were buried at, where they lived at, their families, where they were born. He does an excellent job. Now, the largest of the regiments were the 29th F Company, and he lists all of the 29th F Company. Um, and that's significant and important. He also lists the commander of the 29th Company, and we're going to talk to him about the 8th Wisconsin, the commander of the 8th Wisconsin, which was John Jefferson. John Jefferson lives in Wisconsin. He comes with his father and brother. Beverly Jefferson, his brother, who enlists in the 6th Wisconsin. John Jefferson is the grandson of uh, Sally Hemings and President uh, Thomas Jefferson, and they very he is very active. His family and friends and his unit loves him. He's active in the Mississippi Vicksburg siege along Tennessee. He is the one of the major people who helped make Ulysses Grant successful in that theater with his fighting men. He's wounded twice. He is an African American, light skinned. In some cases, he passes. Not in all cases, but in some cases, he passes. Um, but he is brilliant and he does a tremendous job in the Mississippi Vicksburg siege along there. He comes back from time to time during the winter months to recruit more troops, and when the war is over, he makes the decision to settle down in the Tennessee area where he has a family, and he eventually is buried down in the Tennessee area. So there's some interesting things in the early part of the book as he talks about African Americans coming to the western part of the state, both as free people and as enslaved people, and settling in there. And some of those very people eventually um, enlist into the Civil War. What I want to say is that he what I want to say is that if you look at the entire state, there are African Americans all over. Not a lot of them, but a small number of African Americans almost in the western part of the state. There's the Cheyenne Valley and Pleasant Ridge. They are in La Crosse, and even in the small little towns all throughout that area. Many of them come there as enslaved people who eventually get their freedom. Many of them come there as free people, and they settle in those areas, and they enlist. Uh, One of them is Mr. Green. Mr. Green becomes a sergeant, and Thomas Green is his name, becomes a sergeant and is revered and loved and makes a great contribution. The State Historical Society has the drum from the Cheyenne Valley area where one of the young people played drum, was a drummer in the and his unit. Again, if we look at the eastern part of the state, we've got African Americans recruiting and participating in the Civil War, and and um, Clinton, Wisconsin, and Chilton, Wisconsin. There's four or five of them enlisted. They're part of Moses Stanton's family. You got them in Fox Lake, Wisconsin. You got African Americans in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. All of those communities, African Americans, send representatives and such to participate in the Civil War. And even in the northern part, Waukesha, uh, and other parts of the state, there are African Americans who enlist. And I would even step out on the limb and say to you that almost in every unit, there is an African American. Now, what are they doing? Whether they're cooking servants, or whether they are valets, or whether they're fighting soldiers, I can't say. But I can tell you that the African American man clearly stepped up to become an active soldier in the Civil War during that period of time. And the largest of the units was the 29th F Company, and he mentioned the 29th F Company. It had and I'm just guessing off the top of my head, looking at the roster, but you had as many as 300 to 350 African Americans, and some of them were prescription for the $300 that people who did not want to serve, like white guys who did not want to serve in the Civil War, paid a $300 fee, and that was given to the person who served in their behalf. Uh, but then there were some. They came from all over the state. Many of them came from Illinois. They came from Wisconsin, and that was the largest of the group. They were active, and their most popular battle was in Virginia, in the Cradle Battle, when the under Ulysses Grant's command, where they called themselves blowing up a cradle to allow the troops to penetrate and attack the Confederates. Well, in this case, it collapsed. The idea of blowing this cradle up only backfired, and so many of the soldiers were passed away as a result of it. And it was not a very good success, but it was one of the things in which they did. Are we ready yet?
We don't have them, so you must have technical difficulties.
Oh, okay.
So,
So we don't have him, and we've had some. He must have some technical difficulties. So we're going to sign off, I guess,
we'll reschedule.
and we will reschedule to another time and learn more about his book. It is called the
Put it on
Make Way for Liberty: African Americans, Wisconsin's African Americans in the Civil War. And I have to say to you before we get off, I have spent the last 3 hours reading it. It's really a fantastic read. It does not just look at the Civil War, although that's what he started out with. It really did look at early African American families coming to the state of Wisconsin and the circumstances in which they found themselves in, primarily in the western part of the state. Not as much in the Milwaukee area, but it was a very interesting read, and I encourage you all to pick the book up. Um, and you can get it online. We have a few copies here. Um, it's a good read, and please take the time to read it. We're going to reschedule this, and
In person too.
we're going to reschedule this and get back to you. Thank you very much for tuning in. Have a good evening to you. Thank you. Good night. All righty.